array of initiatives that were so much in vogue during the last decades that involved national policymakers tying their own hands through hard pegs to hard currencies, through trade and investment agreements that preclude the use of capital controls and other developmentalist kinds of policies, and through the adoption of recessionary inflation targets. And so, depending upon how things play out in Europe, we may find that there's yet another locus of discussion about problems with different important dimensions of the neoliberal policy and the way, in particular, it's constrained policy space in peripheral and semi-peripheral countries. I'd also note that it appears that we're very much in a strange new world when the European Union seems to be out IMFing the IMF at this point, such that some commentators, I'm thinking even recently about Joe Stiglitz's comments that Greece would do well to go to the IMF instead of the EU because the IMF is offering countries better terms on their bailouts than the EU and the Germans appear inclined to be. I'll just wrap up here and say, in conclusion, I recognize that what I think we all want from the IMF is for it to recant its misguided neoliberal biases of the last several decades. And I think it's understandable that those of us that have been waiting so long for that kind of recantation are not apt to be satisfied with anything less than a full denouncement of the neoliberal regime. And I think this helps to account for the pessimism of many progressives at the present time. But I would note that intellectual change and ideological change doesn't happen just that way. It's not a neat or consistent process. It never has been, and I think we would do well to recognize that it may not be at the present time. Change can be messy. It can entail moments of ideological, theoretical, and policy incoherence. And I think it's best that we recognize that the current moment may be just that, when incoherence could be productive of new thinking, new strategies, and new achievements. I think particularly if progressive economists capitalize on the apertures that are being created at the current time. Thanks.
To think through the mechanisms by which crisis is transmitted to developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiba, for that introduction. I'm afraid I'm not going to deliver on my promise, even though my promise was only, it's less than a day old. But that just goes to show you how reliable such promises are. I'm going to make a few rather ad hoc remarks, I think more of an empirical nature about the developing countries in the current crisis. And I will not talk a great deal about distribution, although I think there is a lot to be said about that, but I will say only a word or two in regard to distribution and speak a bit more about the way in which the growth pattern, the changing pattern of growth in the world system has been made bare by the current crisis and what some of the implications of that may be. Let me thank the students who organized this conference, first of all, for this wonderful opportunity. I think it shows enormous initiative and also good sense to organize a conference of this kind in this moment. As Professor Sheikh mentioned, there has been an extraordinary loss of credibility of the discipline of economics, at least those dominant strands within the discipline which have emphasized market efficiency and optimality. I think it's fair to say that there has, as all of you know, that there has not been a moment of this kind in living memory. And yet, there is a scramble on the part of the economists who have advocated those very sanguine Panglossian perspectives to shore up their vision and to provide various sorts of rationalizations. So it's extremely important, I think, in this moment to have alternative ways of interpreting the economic world made available. there is a joke which some of you may have heard that goes as follows. If one is simply confused about macroeconomics, then one has not learned very much. But if one is profoundly confused, then one has learned a great deal. And I think the crisis has given the benighted masses who were only ordinarily confused the opportunity to reach the rarefied state of being profoundly confused. And this is one of the contributions it's made. Even many professional economists, as you know, didn't have very much knowledge of the microstructure of the financial markets before this crisis hit, and they found themselves, I include myself in that group, having to take a quick course involving intensive reading of the Financial Times and auxiliary materials in that microstructure in order to understand what's taking place. With the pre-existing perspectives on offer having been too aggregative, too abstract, too simplifying. And one of the things that this crisis has made clear is that the details do matter. The devil was very much in the details. My purpose today is, of course, and my task today is not to talk about that history of causation of the crisis, but there's a lot to say about that, and many of you know a great deal, probably more than I do, about it. Let me make one more kind of preliminary remark. There is a tendency, I think, in the world, it's an unfortunate cognitive bias, perhaps, that many people have, to think that all good things must go together or all bad things must go together. And a version of that is the idea that in time, everything must be getting better for everyone, or everything must be getting worse for everyone. My intellectual antagonist, Professor Salah Martin at Columbia University, for example, has been writing a spate of articles arguing that poverty has been falling and inequality has been falling and globalization is good. Globalization, as he understands it, involving free trade, free capital mobility, and so on. So it's very important to him to say that all of those things are happening together. And contrarily, it seems sometimes to be the case that some of those on the other side want to argue that exactly the inverse of all of those propositions is true. I've never fully understood why it's requisite to believe in a particular set of empirical postulates of that of the sort that the world is getting worse in all respects in order to advocate policies which involve greater inclusion or greater democratic participation in institutions. The world could be getting better in certain respects, at least for some, and it could be quite inadequate with respect to democratic participation or economic inclusion, for example. I think that the present crisis presents us with a situation which possesses this sort of complexity, certainly in relation to the developing countries. Some developing countries, as many of you know, have in a sense had a good crisis. They're developing countries that have, at least for the moment, shown themselves to have been relatively unscathed by the crisis. And other developing countries have been quite badly hit by it. So one very illustrative comparison, and it's just one comparison one could make in this regard, is that between Brazil and Mexico. Mexico has been quite badly hit by the crisis because of its close connection to the US economy. Brazil seems to be doing better than ever. And there are a variety of reasons that might be true, but it seems to have been experiencing robust growth. According to some in Brazil, there has been a marked reduction in inequality. That seems to have been going on for the last 5 years or so. There are various positive signs in Brazil. Brazil is one of those countries, and this is, I think, true of another, of a few large developing countries in particular, which appear to be experiencing a virtuous cycle of semi-autonomous growth and development. I say semi-autonomous because it's at this point extremely unclear to what extent the process is really capable of being sustained purely through internal demand and internal factors. But certainly the contribution of internal demand in the large continental-sized developing countries such as Brazil